The wind came with us from Cheyenne, or at least that's what I told myself. Josie had her hands pressed flat against the dashboard like she was bracing for something. Not because the road was rough, but because the land was doing that thing it does in Wyoming, where it opens up so wide and so fast that your body mistakes the view for falling. We'd been driving for 6 hours by then. The last town with a stoplight was 90 minutes behind us, and the GPS had stopped recalculating about 20 miles back. It just showed a blue dot on a beige field, crawling northwest, like something that didn't know it was lost. I should tell you why we moved. Not because it matters to the story exactly, but because if I don't explain it, you'll assume we were running from something. We weren't. Josie had gotten a position teaching 7th grade science at a consolidated school that served 4 towns across 2 counties. And I had a remote drafting job that I could do from anywhere with a signal. The town was called Harrod. Population 206, according to the census, though Josie joked that the number probably included livestock. The school district had offered a signing bonus and subsidized housing, which in that part of Wyoming meant a 3-bedroom house on a quarter acre for $400 a month. The catch was the contract, 3 years minimum. The district had been burned before by teachers who lasted 1 winter and then fled back to wherever the wind didn't try to peel the paint off your car. Josie signed. She was stubborn that way, and I loved that about her, even when it put us on a highway that seemed to narrow the further we drove, as if the state itself was funneling us towards something it had already decided. Harrod sat in a basin between 2 ridgelines, the kind of shallow valley where the grass was yellow gold in September and the wind had nowhere to go but through. The town was a grid of maybe 8 streets running north-south and 5 running east-west, with a main road that connected to the county highway about 4 miles out. There was a grocery store that doubled as a hardware store, a post office the size of a shed, a bar called The Roan that had a hand-painted sign showing a horse mid-stride, a church, Lutheran, white-clappered, unremarkable, a volunteer fire station with 2 bays and a flag that flew horizontal most days because the wind never really let up. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the quiet, the wind. People talk about small towns being quiet, and maybe some are. Harrod wasn't quiet. Harrod was loud in a way that had nothing to do with people. The wind came over the ridgeline from the northwest, and it made a sound against the buildings and the fences and the few remaining cottonwoods along the creek that ran through the south side of town, a sound that wasn't a whistle or a moan exactly, but something lower, more textured, like the land was breathing through its teeth. Josie said it sounded like someone dragging furniture in the apartment above you. I thought it sounded like an argument happening in another room. Either way, it was constant. You learned to talk over it. You learned to sleep under it. You learned that it changed pitch around 3 in the morning, and you learned not to think too hard about why. We pulled into town on a Thursday afternoon, and the first person we met was marget-eyed. She was standing at the end of our driveway, which wasn't really a driveway so much as a patch of gravel that blurred into the road, and she was holding a ceramic dish, covered in foil. She was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, with white hair cut close, and practical and hands that looked like they'd spent 40 years gripping fence wire. She smiled when we got out of the car, but it was the kind of smile that seemed to be checking something first. "Welcome," she said. "I'm next door. I brought you bars." She held up the dish. "Oatmeal date. Don't worry. I'm not one of those neighbors. I just wanted to catch you before it gets dark." It was 2 in the afternoon. The sun was bright enough that I had to squint. I looked at Josie and she looked at me. And we both did the thing couples do, where we decided, without speaking, to be polite and not ask. Margaret walked us around the outside of the house, pointing out where the furnace vent was, where the crawl space access was, where the water shutoff was. Normal stuff, practical stuff. She spoke the way people in that part of the country speak, direct and flat, every sentence carrying only the weight it needed. Then she stopped at the back of the house, where the yard sloped down toward the creek and the cottonwoods and the open field beyond them. And she said something that I remember word for word, because of the way she said it. "You'll get a packet from the town clerk," she said. "Read it before Saturday. The whole thing. Both of you. Don't skim it." Josie asked what kind of packet. Margaret said, "It's got the schedule for trash pickup, the water board contact, school bus route for your students, things like that. And the community guidelines, the way someone might say load-bearing wall. Not with fear, with structural respect." I asked if the guidelines were strict. Margaret looked at me, and for the first time her expression had nothing polite in it at all. It was appraising, measuring. "They're not strict," she said. "They're specific." She handed me the oatmeal bars and told us to leave the porch light on tonight. And then she walked back across the yard to her house, which was a low gray ranch with a satellite dish and a garden that was already put to bed for the season. The whole interaction lasted maybe 10 minutes, and I thought about it for the rest of the day. The house was fine, clean, mostly furnished with that particular smell of emptiness that houses get when no one's lived in them for a while. The previous tenants had been another teacher and her husband, according to the school district, and they'd left after 1 year. The contract had a buyout clause. They'd paid it. No one told us why. We spent that first evening unpacking boxes and eating oatmeal bars, which were excellent, and listening to the wind push against the windows like it was testing them. Around 8 o'clock, I plugged in the modem and tried to get online. The signal was thin but functional. I checked email. I checked the weather. I checked the news. Everything felt normal and distant, the way the outside world starts to feel when you're somewhere that the outside world doesn't think about very often. Josie asked what kind of packet. Margaret said, "It's got the schedule for trash pickup, the water board contact, school bus route for your students, things like that. And the community guidelines, the way someone might say load-bearing wall. Not with fear, with structural respect." I asked if the guidelines were strict. Margaret looked at me, and for the first time her expression had nothing polite in it at all. It was appraising, measuring. "They're not strict," she said. "They're specific." She handed me the oatmeal bars and told us to leave the porch light on tonight. And then she walked back across the yard to her house, which was a low gray ranch with a satellite dish and a garden that was already put to bed for the season. The whole interaction lasted maybe 10 minutes, and I thought about it for the rest of the day. The house was fine, clean, mostly furnished with that particular smell of emptiness that houses get when no one's lived in them for a while. The previous tenants had been another teacher and her husband, according to the school district, and they'd left after 1 year. The contract had a buyout clause. They'd paid it. No one told us why. We spent that first evening unpacking boxes and eating oatmeal bars, which were excellent, and listening to the wind push against the windows like it was testing them. Around 8 o'clock, I plugged in the modem and tried to get online. The signal was thin but functional. I checked email. I checked the weather. I checked the news. Everything felt normal and distant, the way the outside world starts to feel when you're somewhere that the outside world doesn't think about very often. Josie was in the bedroom putting sheets on the mattress. I heard her call my name, not urgently, just curiously. I went in, and she was standing by the window holding a piece of paper she'd found taped to the inside of the closet door. It was handwritten, blocky capital letters, blue ink on lined paper. It said, "Follow the packet, not because you believe it, because they're right." I took it from her. The paper was old enough that the edges had yellowed, but new enough that the ink hadn't faded. I turned it over. Nothing on the back. Josie said, "That's encouraging." I said, "Probably just someone messing around." She gave me the look she gives me when I say something she knows I don't believe, and we left it at that. The packet arrived Friday morning. It was in our mailbox, which was a dented metal box on a post at the end of the gravel. No postmark, no return address, just a manila envelope with our names on it in typed print. Inside was about 15 pages, stapled, with a cover sheet that said Harrod Community Reference Gude, and below that, in smaller type, revised annually by the town board. Most of it was what Margit had described. Trash pickup was Tuesday. Water board meetings were the first Monday of each month. The school bus route was mapped out with little numbered dots. There was a page about the volunteer fire department and how to join. There was a page about the church schedule. There was a phone tree for weather emergencies. And then there were the guidelines. They started on page 9. The header said, "Seasonal Community Practices," and they were numbered, but not in a way that suggested rules exactly. More like instructions. The kind of thing you'd find in a manual for equipment that could hurt you if you used it wrong. I'll tell you what they said, because I think it matters that you hear them the way we heard them, which was sitting at the kitchen table on a Friday morning with coffee, reading them out loud to each other and feeling the slow, weird weight of them settle in. 1. Between September 1st and April 30th, do not leave your home between midnight and 4 a.m. If you must, drive. Do not walk. If your car won't start, stay inside and call someone from the phone tree. Do not walk. 2. If you hear knocking at your door between those hours, do not answer it. Do not look through the peephole. Do not acknowledge the knocking in any way. It will stop. Keep your porch light on from dusk to dawn, September through April. Replace the bulb immediately if it burns out. Margit Ida has spare bulbs. We both paused on that one. Josie looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said what we were thinking, which was that Margit's comment about the porch light hadn't been a suggestion. 4. The creek on the south side of town floods in spring. Do not attempt to cross it on foot between March and May. Use the bridge on Garfield Street. If the bridge is impassable, do not cross. 5. If you see lights in the field south of the creek between November and February, do not approach them. Do not mention them to anyone outside of Harrod. 6. The community siren will sound once at noon on Wednesdays for testing. If it sounds at any other time, go inside immediately, close all windows and doors, and wait for the all clear, which will be 3 short blasts. Do not go outside during a non-test siren. 7. Do not dig below 4 feet on your property without consulting the town board. 8. The Lutheran Church holds a service every Sunday at 10 a.m. Attendance is not mandatory. Attendance on the first Sunday of October is expected. 9. If a member of the community tells you that tonight is not a good night to be out, listen to them. They are not being unfriendly. They know more than you do, and they will tell you more when you are ready. 10. Welcome to Harrod. These guidelines exist because we have lived here long enough to know they are necessary. We do not ask you to understand. We ask you to participate. That was it. No explanation. No appendix. No FAQ. Josie put the packet down and took a drink of her coffee. I could hear the wind outside, steady and insistent, and the cottonwoods scraping against each other down by the creek. She said, "So either this town has an incredibly committed sense of humor, or we just moved somewhere interesting." I said something about how rural communities have traditions, and how a lot of this was probably just old-timer stuff carried over from decades of people living in harsh conditions. Flooding, dangerous wildlife, isolation psychology. I said it in a way that made it sound like I was being reasonable, but really I was just narrating over the feeling I had, which was the same feeling you get when you step onto ice and hear it creak. Not breaking yet, just letting you know it knows you're there. We spent Saturday unpacking the rest of the boxes and setting up Josie's classroom materials on the dining room table. She had binders and lab kits and a laminated periodic table she'd had since college. She was methodical about it, sorting things into weeks, and I liked watching her work because it made the house feel like somewhere we lived instead of somewhere we'd landed. Around 4 in the afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Not a late-night knock. A regular daylight knock. I opened it, and there were 2 men standing on the porch. One was probably 50, lean, with a wind-burned face and a canvas jacket. The other was younger, mid-30s maybe, bigger, with a beard and a ball cap that said Herod Vol, fire on it. The older one introduced himself as Dale Pressler. The younger one was his son, Kevin. Dale said they were on the town board and wanted to welcome us and make sure we'd gotten the packet. I said we had. He nodded like I'd passed something. "Good," he said. "You read the whole thing?" I said yes. He looked at Josie, who had come to stand behind me. She said yes, too. Dale said, "I know how it reads. I know what you're probably thinking. But I want you to understand that nobody in Herod is crazy, and nobody is trying to scare you. Everything in that packet is there because of things that have happened, not things that might happen. You follow?" I said I did, even though I didn't completely. Kevin hadn't said much. He was looking past us into the house, not in a rude way, more like he was checking something. He said, "You got your porch light working?" I said it was on. "Good," he said. "You need anything. I'm 3 houses down on the same side as Margit. The one with the blue truck." They left. The interaction was oddly formal for 2 guys in work boots and canvas, but it didn't feel threatening. It felt like being briefed. Josie started teaching the following Monday. The school was in a town called Decker, about 22 miles east, and she drove there each morning in our Subaru, leaving around 6:30 and getting back around 4. I worked from the spare bedroom we'd set up as an office, doing CAD drawings for an engineering firm in Denver, and the rhythm of the days fell into place quickly. Wake up. Coffee. Josie leaves. I work. Lunch. I work more. Josie comes home. Dinner. Read. Sleep. The wind blew. The porch light stayed on. For the first 2 weeks, nothing happened that the guidelines would have predicted. No midnight knocking. No siren. No lights in the field. The creek was low and sluggish, and I walked along it on the weekend and nothing about it seemed threatening. I started to relax into the idea that the packet was just a local eccentricity, a kind of folklore document that the town maintained because it was part of their identity. Margit came over for dinner the second Saturday. She brought a bottle of wine that she said came from a relative in Montana, and she sat at our table and told us about Herod. The town had been founded in 1891 by a group of Norwegian and German homesteaders who'd come up from the rail line. They'd picked the basin because of the creek and the natural windbreak of the ridgelines and the grass, which was thick enough then to support cattle year-round. The name came from one of the original families, the Herods, who'd built the first permanent structure, a sod house that eventually became the site of the church. Margaret's own family, the Ides, had been in Harrod since 1904. She'd grown up there, left for college in Laramie, come back, married a rancher named Gus who died in 2011, and hadn't seriously considered leaving since. "Why would I?" she said. "I know how to live here." She said that last part, with something behind it, something she was choosing not to hand us yet. Josie noticed it too. I could tell because Josie leaned forward slightly, the way she does when a student says something that's almost right, but not quite. Josie asked about the guidelines. Margaret set down her wine glass and didn't pick it up again for a long time. She said, "What do you want to know?" Josie said, "Are they real? I mean, are the things they describe real?" Margaret said, "The guidelines are real. Whether you believe what's behind them is your business. But I'll tell you this. Every person in this town follows them. Not most people. Every person. Dale Pressler follows them. Kevin follows them. The Maddoxes follow them. Pastor Lund follows them. I follow them. And we're all still here." I asked what she meant by still here. She looked at me, and her face did something complicated. Not pity exactly. More like the patience of someone who's explained a thing many times and knows that explanation only goes so far. "There have been people who didn't follow them," she said. "They're not here anymore." I asked if they'd left. Margaret said some of them left. The first Wednesday in October, the siren went off at noon. Right on schedule. It was a long, flat tone that rolled over the town and echoed off the ridgelines, and then stopped. I was at my desk working. I barely noticed it. The following Sunday was the first Sunday of October, Guideline 8, the one that said attendance was expected. Josie and I aren't religious. We'd talked about it and agreed we'd go. Not because of the guidelines specifically, but because we were new and it seemed like the kind of thing that would matter to the community. But I noticed we were both up earlier than usual, and I noticed that Josie put on nicer clothes than she would for a regular church visit. And I noticed that neither of us suggested skipping it. The Lutheran church was small inside, wooden pews, maybe 12 rows on each side, a simple altar with a brass cross and 2 candle holders. The windows were plain glass, no stained designs, just clear panes that let in the cold morning light. Almost the entire town was there. I recognized Dale and Kevin Pressler sitting near the front. Margaret was across the aisle from them. There were families I hadn't met yet, older couples, a few teenagers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, which was comforting in its normalcy. Pastor Lund was a tall, spare woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair and a voice that carried without effort. The service was standard Lutheran liturgy, hymns I half recognized from attending church with my grandmother as a kid. Nothing strange, nothing coded. Just a regular Sunday service in a small Wyoming church. Until the end. After the final hymn, Pastor Lund didn't give a benediction. She stood at the pulpit and she looked at the congregation and she said, "As we do each year, I want to acknowledge that we are here because of the agreement. I want to acknowledge that the terms remain. And I want to welcome Josie and Nathan, who have joined our community and who will, in time, come to understand what that means. We are glad you are here. We ask you to trust us until trust is no longer necessary." Then she smiled, and the smile was warm and genuine. And she said, "Go in peace." And everyone stood and filed out and shook hands and talked about the weather and the coming winter. And Josie held my arm as we walked to the car, and she said very quietly, "What agreement?" I didn't know. but the word sat in my chest like a stone I'd accidentally swallowed, and I could feel its weight every time I breathed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind was doing its 3 a.m. thing, shifting pitch, and I lay in bed listening to it and trying to decide if I was afraid or just alert. There's a difference, but at 3 in the morning in a town you don't fully understand yet, the difference gets thin. I got up and went to the kitchen for water. The porch light was on, casting a yellow circle on the gravel in the edge of the yard. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark and the wind-pushed grass and the line of cottonwoods along the creek, which were black shapes against a blacker sky. And I saw something. Not a light, not a figure, a movement. Down by the creek, something was moving in a way that didn't match the wind. The grass and the trees were all bending northeast, pushed by the same force, but this thing, whatever it was moving against the current, slowly, deliberately, south to north, parallel to the creek, and it was large enough that I could see the grass parting around it. But I couldn't see what it was. It was as if the darkness in that spot was thicker, denser, more present than the darkness around it. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds. Then it stopped. And I had the very clear, very physical sensation that it was now watching me. I stepped back from the window. My heart was going hard, and my mouth was dry, and every part of my brain that handles threat assessment was firing at once. I stood in the middle of the kitchen in the dark, and I breathed, and I waited, and after a while I went back to the window, and whatever it was had gone. The grass was moving uniformly again. The creek was just a creek. I went back to bed. Josie was asleep. I lay there and I listened to the wind and I thought about the note in the closet. Follow the packet. Not because you believe it. Because they're right. I didn't tell Josie what I'd seen. Not the next morning. Not that week. I told myself it was because I wasn't sure what I'd seen, which was partly true. But mostly I didn't tell her because I didn't want to be the kind of person who sees something in the dark and turns it into a story. I'd always been skeptical, practical. The kind of person who looks for the rational explanation and usually finds one. A deer, a trick of the light, pareidolia, wind doing strange things to the landscape. I ran through every possibility, and none of them fit. But I told myself they did. The weeks passed. October settled into November. The temperature dropped. The wind got colder and sharper, and the cottonwoods lost their leaves and stood like gray bones along the creek. Josie was settling into her teaching, coming home with stories about her students that were sometimes funny and sometimes heartbreaking. She was good at her job. The kids liked her. She'd started a science club that met on Thursdays after school, and 3 students had signed up, which for a school that small was apparently a triumph. I was doing my work, meeting my deadlines, talking to my project manager in Denver on video calls that felt increasingly surreal. Sitting in a house in a town of 200 people discussing ductwork specifications for a hospital expansion in Aurora. The contrast between my professional world and my physical world was so extreme that it started to feel like I was living in 2 realities at once, and only one of them had rules about not going outside at night. It was Margit who changed things. And I want to be clear about this, because it matters. Margit didn't change things by telling us something we shouldn't have known, or by leading us deeper into some mystery we couldn't handle. She changed things by being honest with us on her own terms, in her own time, because she decided we were ready. It was a Tuesday evening in mid-November, cold enough that the windows had frost on the inside. Josie was at the table grading papers. I was making soup. There was a knock at the door, a regular knock, before midnight, and it was Margit holding a Tupperware container of something that smelled like dill. "I'm not staying long," she said, "but there's something I want to show you both. Not tonight. Saturday, if you're free. During the day." Josie asked what it was. Margit said, "There's a place south of the creek I think you should see. Gus showed it to me when we got married. His father showed it to him when he was 12. It's not dangerous during the day. But I think once you see it, the guidelines will make more sense." She didn't elaborate. She left the Tupperware, which turned out to be potato soup, and she went home. Josie and I looked at each other and had one of those wordless conversations where you both decide something without deciding it. And on Saturday morning we put on boots and jackets and met Margit at the edge of her yard. The walk took about 30 minutes. We crossed the creek on the Garfield Street Bridge, which was a simple concrete span over water that was maybe 3 feet wide and 2 inches deep, laughable as a hazard. On the other side, the land opened up into a wide, flat field of brown grass that stretched south toward the far ridgeline. Margit walked steadily, not fast, not slow, and she talked as we went. She told us that the original homesteaders, the ones who founded Harrod in 1891, had chosen the site because of the creek and the shelter. But within the first winter, they'd understood that the basin held something else. She was careful with her language. She didn't say monster. She didn't say spirit. She didn't say curse. She said presence. And she said it the way an engineer might say load. A fact about the structure. "The homesteaders lost 2 people that first winter," she said. "A man named Carl Harrod, one of the founders, and a woman named Elsa Moen. Carl went out to check on cattle in the middle of the night and never came back. They found his boots by the creek, nothing else. Elsa was found in the field, a quarter-mile south of town, sitting upright in the grass, with her eyes open, frozen, no tracks leading to her and no tracks leading away, and the snow around her was undisturbed, as if she'd been set down from above. I asked what happened to them. Margit said, "That depends on who you ask. But the ones who were there said the same thing. There's something in this basin that moves at night, and it has been here longer than us, and it doesn't want us gone. It wants something else." "What does it want?" Josie asked. Margit stopped walking. We were maybe half a mile south of the creek now, in the middle of the field, and the wind was steady and cold, and the sky was a pale, washed-out blue that felt too high, too far away. She pointed ahead of us, about 50 yards further south, to a spot where the grass was slightly different. Not in color, in behavior. The surrounding grass was moving with the wind, bending and rippling, but in this one area, maybe 20 feet across, the grass was still, perfectly, absolutely still. As if the wind, which was blowing at a steady 15 or 20 miles an hour, simply did not exist in that spot. We walked closer. Josie reached out and held my hand. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to make sure we were both paying attention to the same thing. The still zone was circular. The boundary was sharp. You could see individual grass stalks on the edge, bending hard in the wind, while the stalks 6 inches further in stood straight and motionless. She stood at the edge and looked at it the way you look at a sleeping animal, with respect, with distance, with an awareness that the stillness could change. She said, "Gus told me this is the oldest part, the center. There are others that move, that drift, but this one has been here since the town was founded, maybe longer. The homesteaders found it the first summer. They didn't know what it was. They still don't. Nobody does. But they learned, over years, over generations, over people lost and people saved, that it behaves according to patterns, and that if you respect the patterns, you can live beside it. I stepped closer and I felt something. Not a physical sensation exactly, but a change in pressure, like the moment before your ears pop on an airplane. And underneath the wind's constant voice, in the silence of that circle, I heard something else. Not a sound, an absence of sound so complete that it had its own texture, its own weight. It was like hearing what silence actually is when there's nothing, not even air, to carry it. Josie heard it too. I could tell because she squeezed my hand hard enough to hurt. "What are the guidelines?" she asked Margit. "Not the rules we got in the packet. What are they really?" Margit said, "They're the terms." Margit turned to us, and her face was the face of a person who has carried something for decades and is deciding, carefully, who to share the weight with. Not the face of someone guarding a secret. The face of someone stewarding a truth. When the first homesteaders understood what was here, she said, they had a choice, leave or find a way to stay. They chose to stay. Not because they were stupid, because they loved this land. Because they'd already buried their dead in it. Because leaving meant admitting that the world contained something they couldn't fix. And these were people who didn't leave things unfixed. So they watched. They tested. They lost more people. And they learned from every loss. And over the years, over decades, they built the guidelines. Not as superstition, as engineering. Trial and error. What works? What doesn't? When it's safe. When it isn't. She paused. "The agreement Pastor Lund mentioned," she said. "It's not an agreement with this thing. You can't negotiate with the wind. It's an agreement between us, between the people of Herod, that we will maintain the guidelines, that we will protect each other, that we will not pretend this isn't here, and we will not try to control it, and we will not invite attention to it from outside. Because the one thing we know for certain is that attention makes it worse." We walked back to town. Nobody said much. The wind was picking up, and the temperature was dropping. And by the time we crossed the bridge, my face was numb, and my thoughts were numb too. Not from cold, but from the effort of rearranging everything I understood about the place where I lived. That night, Josie and I sat on the couch in the living room, with the porch light on and the curtains drawn, and we talked for a long time. Not about whether it was real, because we'd both stood at the edge of that circle and felt what we felt, and heard what we heard. We talked about what to do. Josie said, we could leave, break the contract, pay the buyout, go back to Cheyenne or Denver or anywhere. I said, we could. She said, but we won't. Will we? And she was right. I'd been thinking about it all afternoon, trying to understand why my first instinct wasn't to run, and I'd realized something that unsettled me more than the thing in the field. I wasn't staying because I was brave. I wasn't staying because I was curious. I was staying because Margit was still here. Dale and Kevin were still here. 206 people were still here, living their lives in a basin that contained something they couldn't explain. And they'd been doing it for over 100 years. And they hadn't fled, and they hadn't collapsed, and they hadn't gone insane. They'd built a system. They'd maintained it. They'd chosen, every single day, to stay and to take care of each other. And that choice struck me as one of the most extraordinary things I'd ever encountered. Not the presence, not the thing in the field, the people. November became December. The cold deepened into something that felt personal, like it had opinions about you. The wind sharpened. Snow came in thin, mean sheets that scoured the ground and piled up in narrow drifts against the buildings and fences. Josie drove to school in the dark and came home in the dark, and the hours of daylight were so few and so pale that they felt borrowed. We followed the guidelines. Every night, the porch light. Every night, inside by midnight. We didn't test them. We didn't probe the edges. We lived within them the way you live within the walls of your house, not because you're imprisoned, but because the walls are what make the house a house. And things happened. I want to be honest about that. Things happened that I cannot explain and will not try to. There was a night in early December when the knocking came. Guideline 2. It was 1:47 a.m., and I was awake because the wind had shifted again and was doing something to the house that made the walls tick like cooling metal. The knocking started at the front door. 3 measured knocks, evenly spaced, with a pause. Then 3 more. It sounded like a person knocking. It sounded exactly like a person knocking. But the rhythm was too even, too mechanical. No variation. No impatience. Just 3, pause, 3, pause, 3, and on and on. And Josie woke up, and we lay in bed together and listened. And neither of us moved, and neither of us spoke. And after about 20 minutes, it stopped. The silence after it stopped was worse than the knocking, because the silence felt like something waiting to see what we'd do. We didn't do anything. We lay there until dawn. The next morning, Margit was in her yard salting her walkway. I went over and told her about the knocking, and she nodded as if I'd told her about a coyote in the trash. It happens more in winter, she said. Gus used to say it was testing the latches. I don't know what it is. I know it stops if you don't answer. I asked her if she'd ever answered. Nobody answers, she said. And then she looked at me and said, nobody who's still here. The second thing happened on a night in mid-December. Josie was asleep, and I was up reading in the living room because I'd gotten into a bad habit of reading too late, which in Herod meant reading until 11, and then realizing I'd been holding the same page for 20 minutes and staring at the wall. I got up to get water, and I looked out the kitchen window, and I saw the lights. Guideline 5. Lights in the field south of the creek, November through February. Don't approach, don't photograph, don't mention them to outsiders. They were pale, bluish white, not like flashlights or headlights or any kind of electric light I'd seen. They moved slowly, in patterns that almost made sense, like a formation of something just too far away to distinguish. They were beautiful. I want to say that because it's true. They were beautiful in the way that deep water is beautiful, in the way that the edge of a cliff is beautiful. Beautiful because of what they implied, not what they were. I watched them for a long time. I don't know how long. When I finally checked the clock, it was 2:15, and I'd been standing at the window for what felt like 5 minutes, but was apparently nearly 2 hours. That disturbed me more than the lights themselves. Not what they were, what they did to time. I went to bed. Josie was sleeping on her side with her hand curled under her chin, and she looked so normal, so completely and stubbornly herself, that I felt a rush of gratitude so intense it almost knocked me over. January was the hardest month, not because of the presents, because of the winter. The temperature dropped to 20 below for a stretch of 11 days, and the wind made it feel like 40 below, and the world outside the house became a hostile environment that would kill you with indifference if you let it. The car wouldn't start on 3 separate mornings, and Josie had to call Kevin Pressler, who came with jumper cables and a thermos of coffee, and talked to her about nothing for 10 minutes while the engine turned over. He was good at that, at being present without making it a thing. The school closed for 2 days during the worst of the cold, and Josie stayed home and we were together in the house, with the wind screaming outside and the walls ticking in the porch. Light burning, and we played cards and cooked elaborate meals and read books to each other. And it was, honestly, one of the best stretches of our marriage. The proximity wasn't stifling. It was anchoring. We were holding each other in place. But there was one night during that cold stretch when something happened that I need to tell you about because it changed how I understood the guidelines and the town and the thing in the basin. It was January 19th. About 2 a.m., the wind was extreme, 50 miles an hour, gusting higher, and the house was shaking in a way that felt like it was thinking about leaving its foundation. Josie and I were both awake, just lying there, holding hands, riding it out. And then the siren went off. Not the noon Wednesday test, not 3 short blasts. One long, continuous wail that rose above the wind and filled the basin and vibrated in my chest and my teeth. Guideline 6, non-test siren. Go inside. Close everything. Wait for the all clear. We were already inside. I got up and checked every window, every door. Josie pulled the curtains tight. We sat on the couch in the living room, and we waited. The siren ran for about 3 minutes and then stopped. The wind kept going. I could hear it battering the houses, and underneath the wind, I could hear something else, something that I can only describe as a low, sustained vibration, like a note played on an instrument too large to see. It wasn't coming from a direction. It was coming from below, from the ground. Then I heard shouting, human shouting, voices in the wind. I went to the window and parted the curtain an inch, and I could see flashlights bobbing and swinging, moving up the street toward the south end of town, toward the creek. 3 people. I recognized Kevin Pressler's blue truck parked at an angle in the road with its headlights on. Kevin was one of the people with a flashlight. Another was Dale. The third was a woman I later learned was Carol Maddox, who was 62 and had been on the town board for 15 years. They were moving with purpose, not panic. Purpose. They crossed the bridge and went into the field, and I lost sight of their flashlights in the dark and the blowing snow. Josie said, "What's happening?" I said, "I don't know." We sat there for 40 minutes. Then the 3 short blasts came. All clear. And about 10 minutes after that, the flashlights reappeared, coming back across the bridge, moving slower now, and I could see that Kevin was carrying something. Not something large. Something small, held close to his chest, wrapped in a jacket. The next morning, I went to Margit's house. She was already up, drinking coffee at her kitchen table. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. I asked her what had happened. She said, "The Olsons' dog got out. Their back door latch failed in the wind. Dog went south across the creek. Kevin and Dale and Carol went to get it." I said, "In the middle of the night? In that wind? With the siren going?" Margit looked at me and her expression was steady and serious. "The siren," she said, "means something is active, moving, closer than usual. When the siren goes, the board sends people out, not to investigate, to retrieve. Anyone who's outside, anything that's outside, you bring it back. You bring it inside. You don't leave anything out there for it." I asked what would have happened to the dog. Margit said, Same thing that happened to Carl Herod. Same thing that happened to Elsa Moen. Same thing that happens to anything that's in the open when it moves. They go somewhere else, and they don't come back. I sat with that for a long time. Not the horror of it, though there was horror. The other thing. The thing that Kevin Pressler had done. He'd gone out into a windstorm at 2 a.m. with something he couldn't see or fight or understand moving through the basin. To save a dog. Not his dog. The Olsen's dog. Because the agreement wasn't just about following rules. It was about the promise that no one in Herod would be left outside. That's what I'd been missing. That's what I hadn't understood about the guidelines. They weren't restrictions. They were a covenant. Every person in that town had agreed to be responsible for every other person, and for every living thing within the boundaries they maintained. And they upheld that agreement not because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't, but because the agreement itself was the only thing that gave the fear a shape they could live with. February came. The cold eased slightly. The wind didn't. Josie had become close with several of her students' families, and she was starting to feel like she belonged in a way that went beyond geography. She told me one evening that one of her students, a girl named Bree Olson, yes, the family with the dog, had asked her after class if she'd read the packet. Josie said yes. Bree said, "Did it scare you?" Josie said, "A little." Bree said, "It scared me too when I was little. But my mom says the scary part isn't the rules. The scary part is imagining living here without them." I thought about that for days. March came, and with it the beginning of what the guidelines called the spring flood. The creek, which had been a joke in September, began to swell. Snowmelt from the ridgelines fed into it, and within 2 weeks it was 4 feet wide and running fast. Brown and opaque with sediment. By mid-March, it had jumped its banks in places, and the field south of town was partially flooded, shallow water spreading across the grass in sheets that reflected the sky. Guideline 4. Don't cross the creek on foot. Use the bridge. If the bridge is impassable, don't cross. I understood now why the guideline existed. And it wasn't just because of the flood. It was because the water changed the boundaries. Margit told me that the still zone I'd seen in November moved in the spring. It drifted, she said, like it was restless. And the water seemed to carry it, or attract it, or maybe just confuse whatever orientation it had. During the flood, the entire field became uncertain. You didn't know where the edges were. You didn't know what was ground and what was something else. The bridge was a known path. The rest was not. I watched the field from the kitchen window every evening. And in March and April I saw things I hadn't seen before. The still zones, plural now, moving across the flooded grass like pockets of calm in a restless sea. Sometimes small, 10 feet across. Sometimes much larger, 50 or 60 feet, expanding and contracting as if they were breathing. They looked wrong. Not dramatically wrong. The water in those zones was flat, while the water around them rippled. Birds didn't fly over them. The wind, which never stopped, seemed to detour around them, creating small eddies and turbulences at their edges that made the grass swirl in patterns that almost looked intentional. One evening in late March, I was watching from the window, and I saw Kevin Pressler and Carol Maddox standing on the bridge. They were looking south into the field, and Kevin had a notebook and was writing something. I realized he was documenting the zones, tracking their movement, mapping them. The next time I saw Kevin, which was at the grocery store buying wire and canned tomatoes, I asked him about it. He looked at me for a moment, assessing, the way his father had assessed us on that first visit. Then he said, "We keep records, going back about 80 years, handwritten at first, then typed. Now I put it in a spreadsheet. Position, size, duration, behavior. Every year we add to it. Every year we understand a little more." I asked what they'd learned. He said, "It's cyclical. The activity peaks in winter and during the flood and then eases in summer. The zones move, but they have tendencies. Like currents, they've been drifting north over the last 30 years, which is why we extended the no-walk hours in the last revision. And they respond to sound. Not all sound. Certain frequencies. The siren was designed to match a frequency that seems to push them south, back toward the field. It doesn't always work, but it works often enough." He said all of this the way a farmer talks about weather, or a mechanic talks about an engine. Not with awe, not with fear, with the practiced familiarity of someone who has been managing a problem for a long time and knows that management, not mastery, is the goal. I asked him if he was afraid. He said, "Sure. Sometimes. When the siren goes and I have to go out. When I hear the knocking. When the zones get close to the bridge. But I'm afraid the way I'm afraid of the wind. Not because it's evil. Because it's big, and I'm not." April arrived, and with it, a thaw. The creek receded, the field drained. The still zones pulled back south, back toward the center where the original ones sat, permanent and patient. The cottonwoods began to bud, tentatively, as if they weren't sure the winter was really done with them. The wind eased from a scream to a conversation, still constant, still present, but softer, livable. Josie was offered a second year on her contract. The buyout on the original 3-year deal was steep enough that it made financial sense to stay regardless. But she told the school board yes before she even told me, which I pretended to be offended by but wasn't. She was happy, not the bright, effortless happiness of someone who's never been tested, the solid, weight-bearing happiness of someone who's found a place that needs her and that she needs in return. I'd started attending the town board meetings. Not as a member, just as a resident who showed up and listened. Dale Pressler chaired them with the same blunt efficiency he brought to everything, running through water reports and road maintenance and school transportation logistics. And then, at the end of each meeting, what he called the monitoring update. Kevin would present his data. Carol would report on any incidents, any observations, any changes to the zones. They discussed adjustments to the guidelines with the seriousness of engineers reviewing a bridge design. Nothing was taken lightly. Nothing was dismissed. Nothing was sensationalized. At the May meeting, Dale looked at me and said, "Nathan, you're an engineer. That right?" I said I was a draftsman technically, but I had an engineering background. He said, "Kevin could use help with the mapping. If you're willing." I said I was. That's how I became part of the system. Not by being trapped, not by being tricked, by being asked, and saying yes. Kevin and I started working together on Saturday mornings, walking the field during the safe hours with GPS equipment and notebooks, marking the positions of whatever residual stillness lingered from the winter cycle. He showed me the records going back to the 1940s, handwritten in ledger books that were kept in a fireproof safe in the town hall, which was really just a room in the back of the grocery store. The handwriting changed every generation, but the format was consistent. Date, time, location, size, duration, behavior, notes. I read through decades of entries. I read about the winter of 1953, when the zones came so far north that they crossed the creek, and one of them sat in the middle of Main Street for 3 days, and the entire town sheltered in the church. I read about 1978, when a family named Gruber ignored the guidelines and drove out of town at 1 a.m. during a siren, and their car was found 14 miles south. Engine running, doors open, no one inside, and the Grubers were never found. I read about 1994, when a University of Wyoming geology student heard about Herod from a friend and came to investigate, and the town board spent 3 days keeping him away from the field, and finally Dale's father, who was the board chair then, drove the student to Sheridan personally and told him that if he published anything, Herod would deny everything, and he would not be welcome back. I read about 2011, the year Margaret's husband Gus died. The entry for December 12th was written in Kevin's handwriting. It said, Gus Ide found deceased on his property, apparent cardiac event. No anomalous activity logged. Margaret Ide informed. Town support initiated. Gus hadn't been taken by the presence. He'd had a heart attack shoveling snow. He died the way people die everywhere, from the ordinary cruelty of a body that stops working. But the entry was in the monitoring log because in Herod, everything was in the monitoring log, because they tracked everything. Because the difference between a natural death and an unnatural one mattered, and the only way to know the difference was to record everything and look for patterns. That's what the guidelines were ultimately. Not folklore, not superstition, not religion. Engineering. A century of iterative design, tested against a phenomenon that couldn't be understood, only managed. Every guideline was written in someone's experience. Every revision was paid for by something lost. Summer came, and it was easy. That's the thing nobody tells you about living with something like this. There are months when it's easy. The zones retreated to the far south of the field and sat there, barely detectable like an ember banked for the season. The wind softened. The creek sparkled. Josie planted a garden, tomatoes and peppers that probably wouldn't survive, but that she insisted on trying because she said optimism should be practiced, not just felt. Margaret came over with advice about soil amendments and stories about Gus that made Josie laugh and made me understand why a woman who'd lost her husband in one of the hardest places in the country had stayed. Margaret stayed because leaving would have meant that the years she'd spent learning to live here didn't count. Leaving would have meant that the agreement was optional, that the covenant was a convenience, and she knew it wasn't. She stayed because every night she turned on her porch light. She was saying something. Not to the presence, to the town, to the people on either side of her. I'm still here. The light is still on. We're still doing this. September again. A full year, the wind returned with its old authority, and the cottonwoods along the creek began to yellow. And the nights lengthened, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. That meant winter was coming and the basin was waking up. I was at my desk one afternoon when Josie called me from the school. Her voice was careful, controlled, the voice she uses when something is wrong and she's choosing how to tell me. There's a new family, she said, moving to Herod. A teacher's aide and her partner. They're arriving Thursday. The school board asked me to help them settle in. I said, okay. She said, I need to figure out how to give them the packet. There was a silence between us that held the weight of everything we'd learned in the past year. The packet would land on their kitchen table the same way it had landed on ours, baffling and strange and vaguely threatening. They'd read it, and they'd look at each other, and one of them would make a joke, and the other would feel that ice creek feeling, and they'd decide, separately and together, what to do with the information. I said, give it to them the way Margaret gave it to us. Straight. Honest. without trying to convince them. And then be there when they have questions. Josie said, "What if they don't want to stay?" I said, "Then they don't stay. The guidelines aren't a cage. They're a blueprint. You can choose not to build the house." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'm going to bring them oatmeal bars." I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks, and I loved her so much in that moment that the feeling was indistinguishable from pain. I want to tell you one more thing. One last thing, and then I'll stop. Because this isn't a story that has an ending. It's a story that has a season, and the season is about to start again. Last week, the end of September, I walked to the field by myself during the day, through the bridge, south across the drained grass to the original still zone. It was there, as it always was, 20 feet across, perfectly calm, the grass inside it standing straight while everything around it bent and rippled. I stood at the edge, and I felt the pressure change, and I heard the deep, textured absence of sound that wasn't silence, but something older than silence. And I spoke to it, not because I thought it could hear me, not because I thought it would respond, because I wanted to say it out loud, the thing I'd come to understand, the thing the homesteaders had understood over a century ago. I said, "I don't know what you are. I don't think I can know, but I'm here, and I'm going to stay, and I'm going to take care of the people around me, and I'm going to keep the lights on." The wind blew, the grass bent, the zone was still. I walked back to town. Margaret was in her yard, raking the first of the fallen leaves. She looked up and saw me coming from the direction of the field, and she didn't ask where I'd been. She just nodded, once, the way you nod at someone who's finished a job you knew they could do. Thursday is coming. The new family will arrive. Josie will meet them with the packet and the oatmeal bars and her steady, stubborn, unflinching honesty. I'll replace the bulb on the porch light because it's been flickering and you don't let it go out. Kevin will add a new row to his spreadsheet. Dale will check the siren. Carol will walk the bridge. Margit will stand in her yard and watch the sky. And know things she'll tell us when we're ready. The wind will blow. It always blows. And somewhere in the field south of the creek, something will stir and shift and wait for winter, and we will be here with our lights on, with our doors closed, with our hands reaching for each other across the dark. I don't understand this place. I don't need to. I live here. And when the knocking comes tonight, as it will, as it does every September when the season turns, I won't answer it. Not because I'm afraid, because I know what it costs to open a door you're supposed to keep closed, and I know what it's worth to be someone who keeps it shut. The porch light is on. Josie is grading papers. Margaret's light is on next door. Kevin's blue truck is parked 3 houses down. We're all still here.